I'm going to pull this down so you guys can hear me here. Take this off. All right, is everyone set up and everyone's audio is working and everything? Do you have something, Joe? Okay. We'll hold on a couple minutes and make sure that we get everyone here. Did you have any audio or anything that you wanted to get set up? You're good? Okay. Anyone else out there, Joe? Or all right, I think we'll get started here. So first of all, thank you guys all for coming. I also want to thank you for being patient. This incident occurred last Friday, and I know that several of you have been calling, reaching out through emails to try to obtain some more information as to where we were with the investigation. And really up until this point, the investigation, as you know, was ongoing, and we certainly wanted to make sure that we did our due diligence and bringing the proper information forward and making sure that that information wasn't tainted at all to protect the validity of the investigation. So we certainly appreciate you being patient with us so we could get you that statement today. Up here with me, of course, I've got Detective Tanya Johnner. She works with our office and she was involved in a good portion of this investigation. We have State's Attorney Birch Burdick with us, Assistant State's Attorney Ryan Youngren, and Assistant State's Attorney Tracy Peters. So with that, I'll begin here. On May 8th at around 9:35 p.m., the Cass County Sheriff's Office, along with Casselton Ambulance, Casselton Fire, responded to the 100 block of 3rd Avenue North in Casselton, North Dakota, on a report of a gunshot. The suspect, identified as William Dittmer, Jr., called 911 and explained that there was an argument and physical altercation at his address outside near his vehicle between he and the victim, identified as Dwayne Turchin. During the altercation, Mr. Dittmer stated that he felt in fear of his life and shot Mr. Turchin. Mr. Dittmer then explained that he went into his home where he called 911 to report the shooting. These statements were corroborated by a witness who observed the incident and provided written and verbal statements as well. Mr. Dittmer told the dispatcher that he placed the firearm used in the shooting in a safe inside his residence and would stay on the phone until deputies arrived to cooperate with him. Mr. Turchin left the scene of the altercation and was found lying near his residence a short time later. Mr. Turchin was located very shortly after by others in the area who called 911 and began to provide medical attention to him. Casselton Ambulance, along with the Cass County Sheriff's Office, arrived to assist in providing life-saving measures. Mr. Turchin was transported to a local Fargo hospital where he passed. As we stated earlier in a previous press release, and still very much in our thoughts and prayers today, are for Mr. Turchin's family as they grieve through this difficult time. Mr. Dittmer was taken into custody and shortly after the incident and cooperated with law enforcement on scene. A sergeant with the Cass County Sheriff's Office, along with a special agent from the Bureau of Criminal Investigation, conducted an interview with Mr. Dittmer that evening, and Mr. Dittmer provided a statement about the incident. Based off of his statements, other witness statements, and evidence collected at the scene and at the hospital, investigators felt there was enough evidence to arrest Mr. Dittmer for murder while the investigation continued over the next few days. Mr. Dittmer was transported to the Cass County Jail where he was booked. Based on information obtained through the investigation, it was learned that Mr. Dittmer and Mr. Turchin knew each other prior to the incident. All information also suggests that this was an isolated incident and there is no reason to believe that anyone else would be in danger from this incident. The Cass County Sheriff's Office, with assistance of the North Dakota Bureau of Criminal Investigation, worked very diligently this weekend into Monday to provide information to the Cass County State's Attorney's Office so they could review evidence, statements, and auto recordings to make a decision on prosecution. I would like to thank, before I turn it over to the State's Attorney's Office, I would like to thank the North Dakota Bureau of Criminal Investigation and North Dakota Highway Patrol who assisted us through the investigation and bringing this information forward. And with that, I'll turn it over to State's Attorney Birch Burdick.
Thank you, Sheriff. First of all, I want to compliment the Sheriff's Department on a very thorough and meticulous investigation, giving us important evidence that we could review and make a determination as to what crime occurred here and whether it was something that we could charge and prosecute. The sheriff arrested Mr. Dittmer last weekend. Our office felt that that was appropriate under the circumstances. Mr. Turchin was dead and had been shot by Mr. Dittmer. That was clear. We had some story at that time as to whether that there was some self-defense element here, but it's important when you have an argument about self-defense to gather evidence to determine whether that in fact is a valid argument and whether it's a credible argument. And so that's really what our office's review was about, to try and take a look at the self-defense situation and determine whether that was a valid defense in this case. A prosecutor normally has to prove a criminal case beyond a reasonable doubt. When there is an element of self-defense, we also have to disprove the existence of self-defense beyond a reasonable doubt. That's a stiff standard. We reviewed all the information that the sheriff's investigation had put together. Based on that information, there were several things that seemed apparent to Mr. Dittmer at the time. One, that he felt threatened by Mr. Turchin. Mr. Turchin was a considerably larger man than Mr. Dittmer. He had presented himself as a challenge to Mr. Dittmer. He was present on Mr. Dittmer's property and challenging him right there at his car. The evidence indicated that when Mr. Dittmer got out of his car, that Mr. Turchin put his hand around his throat and was squeezing his throat. Mr. Dittmer's response was to shoot him with the gun that he was carrying, which eventually led to Mr. Turchin's death. Having looked at the evidence that we have available, we had concluded that we would not be in a position to disprove self-defense beyond a reasonable doubt, which is what we would need to be able to do. For that reason, we have declined to charge Mr. Dittmer on this case. We will have available to you, if you want it later, some copies of our memorandum that documents our review, and we'll have it at the side of the room over here. Feel free to take a copy with you if you like. As I understand it, the sheriff, and I'll let the sheriff comment further on that, the sheriff has a few more elements that they're following up on, but we looked at what we referred to, I think, as the high probability evidence and could not, based on all that evidence, disprove a self-defense argument. It is true on this case, as it is on any case where we might decline prosecution, that if further evidence came to light at a later time, we'd look at that evidence and make a determination as to how it affected our review of the case. At this point, we felt it was appropriate to decline any prosecution for Mr. Dittmer and that Mr. Dittmer be released from custody. I think that's all I've got at this point. So, Sheriff, any follow-up comments?
So certainly, thank you, Birch. We definitely appreciate our relationship with the state's attorney and how we've been able to work together to go over this case and on a number of cases, not only this one, but certainly always appreciate the opportunity to work with your office. And much like he said, we understand that this is a very difficult decision situation, especially when we have the loss of human life. And so, much like he said, we just want to let everyone know that we are going to continue to look at all current evidence that we have, and if any new information is brought forward to us on this case, certainly we would immediately look into that and see if there was new leads or anything of that nature that we could work on to potentially relook at the case. So I guess with that, I would turn it over to you guys for any questions that you may have for either the Sheriff's Office's role in the investigation or the response, or for the State's Attorney's Office in the decision.
Can you give a few more details on what led Mr. Turchin to grab for Mr. Dittmer's throat?
Sure. I believe that the question was, can we give some more details on what led Mr. Turchin to grab for Mr. Dittmer's throat? Is that correct? And certainly I don't know where that decision would have changed for him. Only thing that I could really comment on would be that the two knew each other prior, as I mentioned already, and that there was some history there, some driving behaviors, some vehicle driving behaviors that led to Mr. Turchin potentially wanting to go in and confront Mr. Dittmer that evening.
So I wanted to talk about, you got a tip about alcohol being involved. Was alcohol involved in the incident whatsoever?
We are still waiting for some toxicology reports to come back on that. I don't know the whole history of how they knew each other, other than the fact that they, number one, live very close to each other, just a few residences away, and that there had been reports from when we had talked to neighbors and different witnesses and stuff that the two had discussions before about Mr. Dittmer's driving behavior. So that's the extent to which that I know their relationship. I don't know, Detective John, or if you'd know any more on that. I think that's pretty much the extent.
I don't know if anyone was there when Dittmer was initially detained, but was he distraught at all or showing any remorse? And was he cooperating right away? Did he make it difficult to find him?
Sure. So he was immediately cooperative after the incident. He placed the call to 911 and immediately reported it, and stayed on the phone with dispatchers as they talked to him and tried to gather further information, and stayed on the phone so that when our deputies arrived, they could safely detain him so that they could further question him in reference to the incident. And so he was very, very cooperative.
Are there any resources that kind of helped you with the case, like security footage or anything like that?
This investigation, of course, was pretty extensive over the weekend, and we used a lot of different things to aid in the investigation. We used a drone to get different types of footage, video footage, photographic footage of the scene. We obviously have different types of audio recordings that we were able to listen to, different evidence pieces in that nature, and then of course the good old-fashioned, right, going and talking with witnesses and people who may have seen something and that type of thing.
So was security footage now?
Are you, when you're talking about security footage? Yep, so we did obtain some video footage, one of which did not capture the incident. And as you remember from being out there that night, Andreas, there's not a lot of things in that area. So we were very limited in that sense. Was he already released? They were asking when Mr. Dittmer was released. It's right. It currently is in the process, from what I understand and what they told me earlier. The reason that we're looking at each other is because once that paperwork is started, it goes through different processes. It has to begin over at the courthouse, and then it has to make its way over to the jail, and then they have to do their stuff there, and then eventually that person is let out. So to let you know specifically where that process is at, I wouldn't be able to tell you. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. It is not considered closed, and much like State's Attorney Burdick mentioned, was that all of the pieces that we feel shed light on what took place that night have been examined. At this point, there could be more information that could come forward that we may not know about. I mean, we feel like we've done a very thorough investigation, but even as the night of when the incident occurred, and we would go talk to witnesses, some people would say, hey, I think this person may have seen something, and they hadn't contacted our office. So there could always be that potential that maybe someone saw something. We would certainly hope that they would have came forward at this point. But if, there's always a possibility that maybe someone saw something or heard something and they haven't contacted police yet, and if that was the case, we certainly would do our due diligence to follow up on that information. And so we're not going to close this case out right now. We still want to see it through to the end. And if something becomes new that we have not seen yet, we would want to look at that and see if it would change the outcome in any way. What was that? Which person? Mr. Dittmer? In your background, did he have any past?
He's a concealed weapon permit holder, so he would have had to.
The only, nothing of major, nothing major that we know about. He does have a concealed weapons permit, so when you get one of those or obtain one of those, there is a background done on you. And so some of the things that you may come into contact with law enforcement for wouldn't potentially negate the fact that you could get a concealed weapons permit, such as a traffic citation or anything like that. So I guess it would really come to light of how extensive you're wondering of his contact with law enforcement. So, but nothing of major that would have prohibited him from getting a concealed weapons permit.
Was Dittmer the only one that called 911? Have other people calling in?
There were other people that called 911 because after Mr. Turchin was found on his property, there were people that came to his aid and tried to render medical attention to him, and those individuals had also contacted 911, and they were, our dispatchers are walking them through how they could provide medical attention to him. So I don't know the number of people that called 911, but there were other people.
After Dittmer called that?
Yes, very shortly after. I mean, we're talking a very short window here from when this incident occurred and when he was discovered on his property, within, minutes.
There have been a few cases of gun violence or acts involving guns in the metro area in Casselton County over the last 2 weeks. Does this case resemble any tension blowing up with being stuck at home with the coronavirus, or is this something that has been brewing over for a while?
That would be total speculation on my part, and I'm not going to go down that road because that was not through our investigation. That did not come to light at all. That had any influence on how this case turned out. Any other questions from anyone? No? Much like Birch mentioned, they do have some information over there if you guys would like to grab that from them. I'll give a little bit more information potentially than what we had shared. So, otherwise, if there's no other questions from anyone, thank you.
Back to the gym? I think so. How about you?